Welcome back, wordsmiths and story seekers. I am your host, Daniel Willcocks, broadcasting from the shadowy halls of Devil's Rock HQ. And I am thrilled today to bring you the inaugural interview of the Writer's Chair podcast. And although this is one that I recorded a few months ago for the episode 100 of the Other Stories podcast, go and check out the guys at theotherstories.net. This is one that I am proud to bring to this podcast. And to be honest, when thinking of the talent I could bring onto this show that I could introduce you to, I could think of no one finer than to kick off with Nick Cutter, who is one of, if not my favourite author of all time. And I have devoured most of everything he's ever written. And there are a couple more that I need to jump on, but it's a very, very exciting interview. In this interview, we cover Craig's journey from literary fiction to horror heavyweight. We talk about the deep influence of Stephen King on his work. We talk about why The Queen is one of his most personal novels yet, which came out a few months back and is absolutely amazing, especially if you like bug and body horror. We talk about the evolution of horror, from slashers to psychological depth, and gross out scenes, sensory horror, and writing from lived emotion. So that's all I'm going to say to jump on that. I'm just excited to jump in and let you hear from past Dan a few months ago, speaking to the insanely talented Nick Cutter, and welcome officially to the Writer's Chair podcast. Over to you, past Dan.
Nick Cutter is the pseudonym of Canadian author of short stories and novels, Craig Davidson. His breakout horror thriller, The Troop, won the inaugural James Herbert Award, has been championed by Stephen King, and is one of TikTok's favourite horror novels. As well as having penned The Deep, The Acolyte, Little Heaven, The Handyman Method, co-written with Andrew F. Sullivan, Craig has once again donned the Nick Cutter mask to bring us his latest novel, The Queen, a tale of teenagers, terror, and crawly terrestrials. Craig, welcome to the show.
Daniel, thank you very much for having me again.
No worries. We were saying just before we hit record, we have spoken in the past. We spoke way back it was May of 2018, and we did briefly encounter each other again in Pittsburgh last year for StokerCon, which was wonderful to see. That was a nice little surprise. But I went back and I listened to our old interview just to see if there was any kind of like pull-outs, any threads I can kind of, pick up on our last conversation. And the burning question I have is, have you met Stephen King yet?
I wish. I've shared airspace with him, and that I was in the same years ago. This sort of probably even predated our interview in 2018. Everything, with the pandemic in between.
Yes.
It gives you a spacey sense of time. But he was there with his son Owen, and they had done that book Sleeping Beauties together, and they did an event at a place called Corner Hall here in Toronto, which is I'd say 1,500 seat venue, and packed it right out. I was probably 20th row or something like that. So, I was there.
Breathed it.
I basked in his, sort of his Stephen King-ishness. But that's about the closest I've ever been outside of, taking up stalking late in life and trying to impose myself on him in some way. But he's certainly, as anyone who's read, the Nick Cutter books for sure, but even to a degree in the later Craig Davidson books, he's an enormous influence. And I probably didn't even recognize, like my early books under my own name, I think I was probably influenced by Tom Jones as a short story writer, Chuck Palahniuk maybe, a lot of older boxing writers who I really admired, and and Stephen King was there. Stephen King I'd read still at that point more than anything else, but I think my aesthetic at that point was sort of like, pseudo tough guy. Those books were, concerned about maleness and masculinity and, what is it to be a man in this crazy workaday world of ours? And so Stephen King sort of didn't command the same influence. But as soon as I started writing horror, I realized just how meaningful his work was to me, and how I've always described it as like, imprinting, how a Gosling will imprint on mother or father, and sort of, it's amazing just how commanding his influence has been in certain ways, even without my, I almost consciously try to write away from it, and yet it's one of those things where you write away from it, you sort of go around in a 180 loop and end up just hitting it anyways.
That's it. I think in a weird way, King is almost like the barometer for most horror authors these days, at least. Like, I think it's really difficult to meet someone where it's like, what was your first exposure to horror? Stephen King. Like, that just seems to be the standard thing. I always find it's
your generation too, you'd say, because we're
absolutely
like 15 years separated, and yeah.
My exposure into horror was Cujo.
Okay,
that was the first horror book I read, and I remember reading that and just so freaked out, so deep, so like just gripped by the story. And yeah, most people, even now, there seems to be like a two-tone barometer test. It's what got you into horror, and not even 9 times out of 10, 99 times out of 100, it's Stephen King. And then you go, and then who came next?
Absolutely. They kind of they settle aesthetically on Barker or Shirley Jackson or Straub or whoever. But you're right. The gateway. I've always thought too is that Lovecraft is obviously for a lot of writers. Maybe not. Maybe he's not the first person that they come to, but I think once they come to him and to that universe, it's very beguiling, and it's very something that they take a great deal of influence from. A lot of modern writers and everybody predating, not everybody, but a great deal of writers predating or post-dating, Lovecraft, have used him as his world, I think, as something to pull from, myself as well. But, he was long dead before he could really see his influence. I like to think that Stephen King is one of those writers who, he gets books sent to him for blurbs or whatever, he can see his own influence on the genre while there's still breath left in his lungs, right? It must be interesting for him to see all these books, read all these books, and see, or watch a show like Stranger Things, and realize his aesthetic and the way he comes to story is has such this massive influence that he can see within his lifetime.
Yeah, absolutely. And we will come back to Stephen King, I'm pretty sure, because I've got some questions I think will swing us that way. But before we get into those, for people who might not know who you are and the sort of things you write, can you give a little overview of your writing journey to this day?
Well, being that it's 2024 and the Troop came out in 2014, I guess this makes me a decade in as my sideline as a horror writer. I shouldn't say sideline. It's one of those careers where my pseudonym sort of eclipses my actual, my own name, which I have no concerns about at all. I'm grateful to have a career in any way possible. So, I've written the books that you've mentioned under the name Nick Cutter, and have a couple more under contract that'll come out over the next couple of years, all being well.
This makes me happy.
Oh, good. I'm glad. It makes me happy too. I'm glad to sort of keep my to be able to continue to do this journey basically. And so I started out writing under my own name. I think, as I already said, sort of books of a different nature. And then, but I'd always loved horror. It really truly is my first love. But I was going through the Canadian university system to sort of get an education, but to also give myself the opportunity to write. And at that point in time, and again, we're talking probably 20 years ago now or more, horror would not have been sort of something that you could make an academic focus of. If you want to do a thesis, for example, of like creative thesis, if it had have been a horror novel, it would have had to been one of those very sort of clever ones that sort of almost sideswipes at horror in some way and comes at it from an ironic or detached distance. And I just don't write that way. I just felt like that wasn't going to be the way I was going to do it. So I wrote sort of a literary collection of short stories, and that ended up getting published. And that set me on, about the first 10 years of my creative career as writing under my own name. And then I had this really wonderful opportunity for what has now been the back half of my career, long may it persist, to write horror. And that's why we're sitting here chatting with one another.
Bam. That's quite a span of time spending in the industry. It must be quite rewarding to get to this point and still know that you've got people coming back to you and reading you.
Well, it's been fits and starts. I think my first book came out when I was 29. So, that's fairly young. There's obviously the S.E. Hintons of this world, or the Bret Easton Ellises, who, it's in the 20 and they've done it. But I remember getting that contract and thinking, well, I guess I'm a writer now. And the world had other designs for me. So in between there were, as a job as a bus driver, for example, which I ended up writing a memoir about my time driving a school bus. And so there were periods where I was not strictly a writer. But I would say of that 20 years, I don't know, 17 have probably been as engaged as a full-time writer. So yeah, I'm deeply grateful to be able to do it and to have a partner who, together we're able to sort of like make ends meet, following our separate passions. So yeah, just super grateful to have the opportunity.
You mentioned in your sort of intro to yourself, obviously Stephen King's the first exposure to horror. Do you remember what your first King book was?
I wouldn't be surprised it was one of the short story collections. Maybe Night Shift, maybe Skeleton Crew. My first exposure probably to horror, outside of maybe visual stuff that I saw, maybe a bit too young. I can't even remember it, Daniel. It was a book. It was the book of stories in my elementary school, and I remember there was one story. I was called like the Red Ribbon, and it was this girl who wore a red ribbon around her neck, and she, warned. I mean, there were like 3-4 page stories, like warned, do not touch this, but she was very beguiling, and some suitor or whatever like couldn't help himself, and he pulled the ribbon on, and her head fell off. Even from there, I was clearly just taken with the trappings of horror, and I like the idea of being scared, of sort of testing that level to which I could. It was like, holding your hand over a stove element, which is nothing that I've actually done, but that same idea of like just testing sort of how much you could endure, really, in a way. And I think there's a part of that horror is that way, at least at first. And then you start to see, I think, the deeper and the more resonant things that horror can do, the way it can comment on society and culture and all sorts of other really interesting things that you come to it as a deeper appreciation. But at first, for me, it was just, what could I tolerate? How could I scare the daylights out of myself? And I would think maybe The Bogeyman. I don't know if you read that Stephen King story. I think it was in Night Shift.
Haven't.
Oh, yeah, they made a movie about it maybe a couple of years ago. I didn't watch the movie, but the story itself is terrifying, really well done. So that might have been the one that, and I don't know about you, Daniel, but I read that in the clean light of day in a library, public library, and I sort of put it down, and I looked around, and it bustling, and a busy light was streaming through the windows, and I'm like, that wasn't so bad.
I remember years ago, I got lent a game called Dead Space 2, which I don't know if you're much of a gamer. But
no, I do know Dead Space. Yeah.
Yeah, I was warned how scary it was, and so I sat down at midnight about 2 feet away from the TV, volume loud, and played it. And I didn't get more than 15 minutes through. I was like, it'll be fine. No, it gets, when you're in the right environment, it really gets you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's something, movies, obviously, we've, been scared by. I remember watching Hellraiser 2, same thing. Mid-afternoon, friend's house, sort of walking home through the Greenbelt afterwards and being like, well, that's fine. I'm fine. Same thing repeated itself at night. But you wouldn't think video games, but you wouldn't. And certainly, Mario or whatever ones I started with. But once they developed that specific horror, like some of the Resident Evil ones I remember playing, and like, yeah, they're a nightmare factory, just like a good book or a good movie.
Do you think that, so as an individual, I find that when I speak to a lot of horror authors, it is that kind of journey from, I just want to look at something gruesome. And that experience of enjoying horror tends to mature into sort of like themes. And in a weird way for me, it's a kind of therapy. Like I like to kind of look at the psychological side of horror and understand how, bad things work and process that on the page rather than in the real world. And one thing that just from your comments a second ago that kind of came to me was, even in the general larger horror world, it seems to be that the 60s, 70s, 80s were a lot more about sort of slasher, gore, very kind of just like, arguably monstrous horror. And we've kind of evolved today into a much more, I don't want to use the word intelligent, but I guess more mature in the sense of it explores themes, it looks at sort of like critics of the human experience. It seems to be much less about the boo and more about the ick.
I agree. I think, and I think maybe in some ways I'm kind of cut out of time, really, because I think my own work is probably more indebted to the 80s, the sort of even the James Herbert sort of early horror that you would have spoken about, and in a funny way, I'm not sure that's the right term, but I do feel like kind of a throwback, And like, I love the horror that you're talking about. I mean, some people will call it elevated horror, I suppose, which is a term that I just don't exactly know what the qualities of that are, or what where the guardrails are to that. But the idea that horror is a lot more inclusive, and it includes a lot more voices that might have been had an opportunity to really speak to their specific horrors and the way that those worldviews. I just think there's a great deal more of diversity, obviously in the most obvious sense of that, and that there's more voices. And I think, because of that diversity, I think there's a great deal more, just the stories that are being told, I feel like, are things that, you're right, you wouldn't necessarily have seen back in the 80s or the 70s. And some of those authors, if you could pull them forward to present day, I think they'd be ideally not shocked or anything. I think they'd be like more than pleasantly surprised to see just what the genre, I think, has a capacity for. Which is not to say, like, when you talk about, say, the 80s, for example, like Clive Barker, was dealing with all sorts of stuff that would not be in any way out of time with today, right? Or Anne Rice, So it's not like there weren't plenty of writers back then who were sort of walking the same terrain that a lot of writers do today. But I just think there's more space for them now, maybe needful space, and I think there's just more of it, which I think can't do anything but help the genre.
It's beautiful when you add all the voices together. And I think maybe that's one of the things I like so much about your work, is it does have some of that kind of vintage classic literature mixed in with modern day themes. And we mentioned in the intro, you've got a brand new book that is out in some formats, coming out in other formats very, very soon, called The Queen. Do you want to give the listeners a little overview of what the book is about?
Well, without sort of giving anything away, and I always have a bit of a hard time, outlining a book. But you know what? I'll tell you what it. Without spoiling anything, I'll tell you what it really came down to for me. Like, what I gripped to sort of get me through it is, and I imagine this is the exact same way where you are. I want to hope it's more or less a universal experience. But the notion of two close friends who are reaching that point in their existence where they are meeting kind of abruptly hitting a parting of the ways. And I think one of the most common places for that to happen between two people is that interregnum, often the summer between the last year of high school and the beginning of college or adult life, really, the sort of nascent beginnings of what you would say stepping into adulthood. And in my case, I moved away from my hometown, which there was a certain level of excitement because I felt like things had maybe gone stale and me and my parents were at each other's throats, and I think I had new things I wanted to explore, but I wasn't gone for more than a month before I was like miserable and wanted to come back home, right? And you wanted those sureties of your hometown and the friends and the sort of everything that you felt to be the life that you'd really, in a lot of ways, taken for granted. But, I had friends back there who stayed, or some who went to different universities, but specifically with the ones who stayed, I felt like over time, we told each other that things wouldn't change. Mm-hmm. And then over time, inevitably, the phone calls get less so. I came home less. We discovered new friends, new ways of looking at the world. And it's one of those things where you run into them 5 years later on the street of your hometown and you're sort of shocked and saddened at the estrangement that has happened between people who truly felt at some time in their lives that they would always be involved in each other's lives. So outside of all the other, I would say beyond the rest of it, it's like if you've read a Cutter book before, there will be certain things that will...
It's a Cutter book.
Familiar to you? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
If you're asking for something, a specific kind of emotional through line that pulled me through the book and that anchored me to those characters and to really to my own past. It was a book in some ways like The Troop, where I tried to go back into my own that space and time and pull forth emotions and moments that ideally feel somewhat resonant and universal to anyone who's gone through those things.
When we last spoke, you mentioned about people like Robert McCowan, people like Stephen King, who are fantastic at writing the experiences of kids, of teens, of sort of the younger generation. I would argue to put you among that mix as well, particularly with this book as well, because these are teenagers that are dealing with high school, and not just high school, but this is a high school that obviously you haven't experienced because of the advances in social media, the way that society has advanced. How did you tap into what it's like to be a high school student today when you were writing this book?
Oh, Daniel, that's such a hard thing, right? That was one of the main, every book has got landmines, I guess you'd call them, and some before you even set pen to paper, that this is waiting, this is going to be a challenge, a hurdle, and others are ones that you sort of aren't aware of, and they kind of catch you midstream, and you have to figure out a way to sort of slap together a remedy and move through. So I knew, like, again, to go back to The Troop or some of the books I've written under my own name, which have dealt with boyhood. Mm-hmm. Which is normally, again, for I think some of the stuff that we would most remember fondly from, say, Bradbury or McCammon or King, it is often boyhood, and not that they can't write convincingly from girlhood too, interestingly, but I mean, definitely the two things. I was writing out of my gender, and I looked at ways to try and navigate back into my safe zone, and making it boys, but I just didn't, the kind of narrative construction and the things that I wanted to say just didn't cohere in my head if I was going to make them boys. It just didn't feel like it was going to work. And then secondly, you're right, bringing it up to pre-pandemic 2018, when I myself went through those times in my life in like the mid 1990s. Again, what I tried to focus on, Daniel, is like the things that felt universally teenage, if you know what I mean. Like, yes, obviously being a teenager in the 1930s or the 1950s or up to today, things are changing. As we spoke before you started recording, you have a 10-year-old, I have a 12-year-old, and we're often baffled the way that they navigate through their lives, but it feels completely natural to them. And I know my parents looked at me with that same level of bafflement sometimes, and that's just natural. So I almost just took it as a given that there were going to be things that I simply couldn't keep pace with, or I wasn't going to get exactly right. But then again, looking back into my own history, enough time has elapsed that I don't have the recall that I would necessarily even get my own time period right. So what I really tried to dwell on, and what I really tried to focus on in the bigger things are things like first love, and that strange feeling. And as I spoke before, losing somebody who you felt like, and you grew up with, and you felt like all through your early life that you were going to be with, and focusing on the things that feel almost genderless as much as possible. They just feel like part of a universal current of human experience. And if those things are universal and in some way unchanging, or change very little despite, generational differences, then those are the things that I chose to focus on.
And they definitely shone through. I will say, for people who are a fan of the Nick Cutter brand of work, it's punchy, it's visceral, it's gross. One of the things I do like, because I also received a copy of your Handyman Method last year. You were kindly enough to hand that over at the con.
Yeah,
and
of course.
There's always a scene. There's always a very specific scene that sticks with me. I won't say what it is for the Queen this time, but I will touch on the Handyman Method, the drain.
Sure, of course.
There just seems to be that real, brand and stamp that is a Nick Cutter that will gross you out and you will get under your skin. And I don't know how you do it, but it's something I aspire to, because the prose it's just a combination of being realistic and gross, and also just there's a kind of poetry that flows through it that makes it work. And
I appreciate it.
There's definitely a lot of that in the opening scene as well.
Yes, well, yeah, and I think I think someone else asked me whether that's sort of purposeful, and it's honestly not. I think it's based on my own aesthetic and the things that I like to write, and so they do naturally occur as baubles on the chain of the narrative that they sort of are developing as you're writing and as you're moving towards them, and often they come in the edits, right? So the first edit might be, sort of a skeletal version of that scene, and then in ensuing edits, I sort of I dwell and I go a little bit deeper, and I put flesh on that skeleton, and I turn those scenes into things that are ideally more resonant. Some I used to, I don't anymore because I have a laptop, but I used to have a tower computer or whatever and a monitor, and I just wrote in Sharpie the five senses.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I had a scene where I felt like I would do my best to be like, okay, do we have something sensory that sort of pings on each one of those senses if possible. And when you because mostly, even definitely in film, but even in writing, it's visual. If you're thinking of it cinematically, but obviously writing gives you that ability to invoke the other senses, scent and touch, and hearing, and taste even. So, and those are I think sometimes underused, maybe less so in horror. I think there's lots of writers who make sure to take advantage of that. But I certainly like to nurse a scene, I think,
Mm-hmm.
a certain into as it goes through its evolution through edits, that it can certainly become something a bit more revolting than it was at first pass.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, actually, because that was something you touched upon in our last interview, and I wanted to throw something back at you. I don't know if this will work or not, but we'll try it. So if you're up for it, I want to list the five senses, and I want you to tell me the most disgusting thing for you within those senses. If we start with sight.
Okay, like you kick over a log at the park, and it's just got like earwigs and bark beetles and all sorts of wet, damp creatures twisting away underneath it.
Perfect. Sound. What are you hearing that's awful?
I've used this before, but an awful sound to me, and it's like a big fat gym rope. Do you guys have those in the UK?
I know what you're talking about. We have
maybe in your case, that's my generation. You had to climb it, and like covered in like axle grease, and a hand sort of like pulling along it. I found that revolting, kind of like crackly, crispy, oily, revolting sound. Yeah.
Oh, we're doing this live. Wow. Smell.
Smell. What's the most revolting thing I've ever smelled? You know what? I used to work at Marineland, which is kind of a SeaWorld sort of a place, and I used to be a dumpster boy, and so a garbage collector, and we used to have to compact stuff. And one time, my buddy thought it would be funny to throw a giant sack of garbage at me, and it had been out in the sun for quite some time, and it had grown some larval life inside of it, and it broke open over me, and maggots sheeted out, and also what those maggots had been eating. And I think in that moment, I think I snuffled some maggots off my nose too. But ever the smell that was in that burst open garbage bag, which again I understand is unique to me and you can't share it, but that was the most revolting thing. And it might have been the purely most revolting experience where I wanted to crawl out of my own skin if I could have.
Oh my God.
And even he, who was up for a good laugh, he saw what he'd done to me, and he just said, you know what I mean? Like immediately, like, oh no, I've gone like 20 times further than this was supposed to go.
There's no step after that.
No. Sorry. You know what? Let's put because now you're going to say taste, and I think some of that went in my mouth.
There you go.
I'll also say that will also be scent and taste together.
Nice. And then that leaves us with touch.
You know, I go back to being a child. Remember, they used to do. You would go in a witch's laboratory at Halloween or something, and you'd reach in and you'd be touching naked eyeballs, and they were peeled grapes. Mm-hmm. That was probably one of the grossest things, because I believed it. You know, at that point, I believed that I had stuffed my hand into a bowl of eyeballs.
Oh God, that reminds me. There's a Ray Bradbury story that I read a while ago in like a horror collection that was about that kind of Halloween experience, and they all go down into the dark and they're passing sort of fruit and pumpkins and that along, but they weren't fruit and pumpkins, they were like cut up people, which was beautiful. so good.
That's gross stuff, man. Like, I love Bradbury. Bradbury is, I wouldn't say he's underappreciated at all. I think he's I hope properly appreciated, but I wonder, I feel like this time of the year people should be reading, everyone always reads Fahrenheit 451, as they should, but Something Wicked This Way Comes is a great Halloween read.
Yes, beautiful prose. We are fast running out of time, and this makes me sad, but let us, because I've got a bunch of questions, literally what we were saying before we came on to record.
Yep.
All the questions.
I knew it. I was talking you off.
Let's go with, so over the last few years, as we say, there's been a lot of horror come out, a lot of new faces, a lot of older faces with some new works. What are your top 3 recommendations of the last few years in terms of reading?
You know, one I always recommend, because he's Canadian and he doesn't really need recommendation, but his name's Wabashig Rice. He's an Indigenous author, and he's written Moon of the Crust of Snow, which is kind of an apocalypse narrative, which I know has been done, but he does it in such a really intelligent and thoughtful, and I think specific to his own upbringing and his own background way and Sherry Demeline is another Indigenous author who did another Canadian sort of apocalyptic called The Marrow Thieves. So I'd say both of them together. We'll count that as one. I've read, and it's another one. You know, Keith Rawson, Devil by Name. I just read. He's an American author. It's I'm trying to remember. It's the second of a 2-part, and I've read both of them. And for whatever reason, the first book is escaping me. But I just finished reading Devil by Name, which is the follow-up to. It'll of course come to me as soon as we're off here.
Of course,
Rawson. Yeah, please check him out. He's excellent. And what's another good one that I would think that I've read lately, horror-wise? You know, I like May Fly by
yes. That's twisted.
Why is her name?
That's CJ Lead.
Yeah, CJ Lead. Yeah, I thought that was an excellent. And as you said, really gory, really went there. But really, you know, I thought the characters were awesome and really well done, and sort of playing with some tropes that are familiar, but she was doing something I think really novel and cool with them. So I mean, I really could go on. This is sort of like just literally looking at my bookshelves, and I don't know about you, but I've got bookshelves all over the house. So if I'm looking at a bookshelf, it'd be like, oh, how about this one? How about that one? So it's so tough, right? Because as you said, the genre is, you know, someone said the other day that they felt like it's, and maybe, I don't know if you agree. I didn't disagree with this. I don't know if I had a super strong opinion, but he said that, you know, since the 80s, since sort of the boom of the 80s, this time that we're in now feels like it's as strong as it's ever been. And I sort of agreed with that, while also thinking, I don't know, horror's just always been, it's you know, it's the monster you can't kill. It's always around, always, you know, it's always minting really interesting writing and interesting writers. But I didn't disagree that we are in a really interesting, thriving time for horror.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously wasn't around in the 80s, so it's hard to kind of on that.
Yeah,
but I think the expansion of the internet has done a lot for horror. I think it's brought a lot of people out of the woodwork and kind of really given praise to people who otherwise wouldn't have voices. I think as well, sort of independent publishing has had something as that it's evolved. That's really sort of brought some more voices out that kind of, you know, swells the ground so that more and more people get that chance to speak their horror. And just, I mean, even this year, the amount of names, like, I'm trying to catch up with all of the books that I've been gifted and that I found and that I bought, just to try and keep up to date with horror. So we are in a very plentiful time, which is beautiful.
It is. It's almost head cracking just how whiplashing how much there is, and the idea of trying to sort of keep up with it is difficult, right? You know, because even, and you know, I mean, some of our favorites, like Clive Barker, doesn't seem to be as prolific as he once was, which is fine. You know what I mean? Like he doesn't owe anybody anything, right? But there are, you know, like King, just that indefatigable engine that just keeps going, right? So there are a lot of great writers who continue to put out really interesting, meaningful work, and they're joined, as always, by new voices that you know, have something meaningful to contribute as well. But my God, yeah, you're right. It's like you want to keep up with it, but it's you just almost have to read horror exclusively, which I don't know if you do or not. I sort of omnivorously, I'm sure you probably do as well, right?
Yeah. Oh, you definitely want to stretch outside of the genre just to see if there's anything you can bring in.
Yeah, exactly, right. Yeah, or and just try out, you know, others. I always like to sometimes read, you know, one of the 2 big books of the year, just to be like, okay, what's, you know, I mean, maybe not like the Colleen Hoover style, not but But like Chris Whitaker's new book, for example, something like that, Hold the Dark. Sorry. Anyway, he's actually I think he's a British writer, but it's one of the big books of the year. So I've ordered it, but I haven't read it yet. But yeah, every so often you like to read outside of your genre, and but if you decide just to read within the genre, you'd be pleased.
Well, as I say, I could chat to you forever, clearly. I also forgot to mention at the top of the show, which I should have, but congratulations, you're appearing on our volume 100 of The Other Stories. So we've been running since 2016. We do 4 episodes in each volume per month. And so we're on volume 100. You're our celebratory.
Congratulations. Yeah, I'm not surprised. You're a very thorough, good, thoughtful interviewer. May you go to 200 or 300 or whatever you decide to do before you hang up your spurs.
666. Yeah, but with that, one final question for you. Where can people find out about everything that you're working on? And I will add a 1.5 question. And where can people get their hands on your new novel, The Queen?
Okay. Well, I do have a website. I'm not particularly online, but I do have a website, www.craigdavidson.net, and we've actually put together my brother put together a really cool website specifically for the Queen. So if you've read the book, it's a kind of a fan service website that if you go there, you'll get all sorts of fun Easter eggs and stuff, and he's done an awesome job with it. So you can just access that right through my main site. And the book is out with Gallery in North America, and it's out with Arcadia in the UK. Is that the name of it? Orcus.
That sounds right.
Yeah, it's their sorry, they have a specific imprint that's the genre. So yes. Anyway, it's out in the UK, or will be it's simultaneous. So yeah, the end of this month, if you're October 29th.
Wonderful. I didn't even get to my bug questions. Anyhow, thank you so much, Craig, for joining us on the show. I really do appreciate you jumping on and sharing your time with us.
My pleasure. Anytime, Daniel.
No worries. And everyone buy The Queen or else.
Didn't I tell you? Didn't I tell you that'd be good? But that is a wrap from the inaugural interview of the Writer's Chair podcast. Thank you so much, Nick/Craig, for joining me on the podcast this week. And an especially big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in. Before you dash off, if you're craving deeper conversation, writing advice, or just fancy hanging out with fellow readers and storytellers, come join the Devil's Rock community on Discord. I'm on a mission to build the largest online space for fans of horror and dark fiction, a home where writers and readers connect, create, and thrive together. It's free, open to all, and always crackling with inspiration. So if you're ready to pull up a virtual chair, head on over to devilsrockbooks.com/podcast for the invite link. And until next time, my friends, write bravely and dream dark.